an empty, snow-covered field. Expensive taxi rides to nowhere. And the most shocking discovery about where my wife was really going every evening? Sometimes the truth is hidden in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the person you married isn't who you thought they were. I'll skip over how my wife Heather and I first met. It's not particularly relevant to this story, which will probably be quite long as it is. I recommend listening to the entire story to fully understand what I experienced during those months, straight from someone who lived it. After our wedding, Heather and I, both approaching 30, decided to move to a major metropolitan area. This decision wasn't easy for us. In our hometown, we'd already established some connections, and things were going reasonably well. But both my wife and I wanted to see life with more open eyes, especially since salaries in our respective fields were sometimes 10 times higher in the big city. We figured that by moving to a major city and doing the same work, we could live completely differently than we were living before. However, the result wasn't as bright and colorful as we'd imagined. We had small savings that would last us about 1 year in this city, maybe a little longer. "Look, Heather," I said, "the step we've decided to take is quite serious. I suggest we spend less, earn more, and save money while we're getting established here." We decided not to have children yet. There would be plenty of time for that question later. Once we got on our feet, I thought that issue would take care of itself. She agreed with everything at the time. But as it turned out, not for long. The bright lights of the big city did their work, and I started hearing requests from her about going to clubs, demands for entertainment, requests for expensive and meaningless purchases, and other trivial nonsense. Didn't we agree on this? I'd ask her, but I never got any reasonable answers from her. She'd also gotten a job in her field immediately, working as a senior manager and helping run, perhaps not formally, but almost an entire division of work at one company. I'm telling you details about her work for good reason. Several more months passed, and then came the first surprise. One evening, I walked into the room where she usually sat with her laptop and saw her on social media, browsing the main page of our new city. "Interested in local news?" I asked her. "I'm communicating with new people. The comments here are sometimes interesting," my wife replied. I now consider that evening the beginning of our end. Sitting on social media isn't forbidden to anyone, and that day I foolishly didn't pay attention to it, as it turned out. Another couple of months passed, and suddenly problems began at Heather's work. Since, as I told you, she was an assistant to the division director and was responsible for things perhaps not formally, but as you understood, she was also responsible. She started staying late. She'd be delayed for 2-3 hours. I was absolutely calm about this because, according to our agreement, our main goal was career advancement and financial success. For exactly this reason, I didn't complain about these delays at all, but only until one random moment. Around this time, February 23rd was approaching, and they had something like a corporate party at her office. This story isn't really about the corporate party, but what happened there sobered me up a bit. Their company was working that day and simply decided to gather in the evening to quickly congratulate all their male colleagues. Late in the evening, my wife called and asked me to pick her up somehow. I was still driving at that time and agreed without question. When I arrived, she said that her direct supervisor and his wife were there, and it would be good for all of us to meet each other. I went in, we sat for a bit, and talked. Their boss turned out to be quite an interesting character, and after their brief corporate event, he and his wife suggested we go to a nearby restaurant for 1 hour. I was honestly ready to go anywhere after work as long as there was food. so I agreed without question. We arrived and sat down for dinner. My wife doesn't drink and hadn't had anything that day either. Her boss, looking at me, said, "Well, since your wife doesn't drink and has the right idea, we basically have one option here." So we ordered whiskey, then another round, and another. We went outside for 5 minutes, and her boss kept praising my wife. I made an offhand comment. Everything seems fine, but as usual, if everything's good at work and you're not home because of work, then people at home are immediately unhappy. But if you sit at home too long, then you're unhappy. I thought this was just a men's problem, but apparently not, since my wife has the same issue. The boss asked what I meant. I said, "Well, all these overtime hours of hers. I'm about to start getting jealous or meeting her after work to check where she was, who she was with, and until what time." The boss was surprised and objected, saying that they hadn't had any overtime for the past 2 months. There really wasn't such a huge workload that they needed to work day and night, especially since my wife had been working there recently, and newcomers certainly didn't have that kind of workload. I was confused at that moment. She'd been coming home later than usual repeatedly. Maybe it was disadvantageous for the boss to justify overtime in front of me. Maybe there was overtime, but he was keeping quiet about it. Or maybe it was time to ask my wife some questions. We had dinner with them that day. My wife drove us all home late at night. The next day, I started thinking about how to find out where my wife was actually going when she said she was working late. Asking her directly, well, she'd already answered me, "To work." When we met again in the kitchen that evening, I asked to borrow her phone to watch something on YouTube. We started having dinner while watching news on her phone. After my wife put her plate in the sink and went to another room, I quickly grabbed her phone and searched through her calls and all her messages. But there was nothing there, of course. Lots of calls from unidentified numbers, probably work, and in the messengers, again, work stuff plus chatter with her girlfriends from our hometown. I was about to lock her phone when her voice from the next room stopped me. She called out that tomorrow, or in the next few days, she'd need to stay late at work again and might be home late. Of course, I could have started confronting her about the non-existent overtime, but I had little evidence, if I could even call it evidence. I started scrolling through everything on her phone and eventually got to the taxi app. That's where I discovered something that took me the next week to figure out. In the ride history, there were several trips that were each more expensive than all the others. All of them in the evening from unclear addresses almost outside the city, and all ending at our building entrance. So Heather was going somewhere during the day, and from that somewhere, she was returning home to us in the evening. I wrote down where the taxi was called from and realized I needed to go there myself. The next day, I got in my car and drove to that location in the evening. Going in the evening was my mistake, but I'd never know that then. I arrived at the point where taxi always picked up my wife, got out of the car, and there was just an empty field. It was dark around, snow, wind blowing. I double-checked a couple of times. Yes, I was in the right place, where my wife often visited. I got back in the car and drove a little further. There were fields all around. I turned on my high beams and drove further according to the GPS. The snow under the wheels was getting deeper, and it was starting to scrape against the bottom of my car. In the light of my headlights, I saw a fence and gates. I turned around and drove home. As I was approaching, my wife called, "Where are you? It's quite late." And someone turns off their phone. "Who's turning off their phone?" I asked. "Dinner's getting cold," she said. "I'm already near the building coming up." We had dinner and went to bed. A couple of days later, she came home later than usual again. What the hell? I thought. I kept trying to figure out where she was going and took her phone again. I couldn't believe my eyes this time again. That same location, where I'd been just a couple of days ago. What, am I supposed to go there again? I was already there, just fields, I thought. But I still decided to drive there in daylight this time. Maybe I'd see something. And to my misfortune, I did see something. I arrived during the day at the same place. Nothing had changed, still a field. I opened the GPS on my phone again and drove along the same single road further. Again, a fence. But this fence was too long and high. I started entering this address into GPS to find out what kind of facility this was. Then I noticed that my phone had no signal at all, near the fence 0 bars. I backed up, and while turning around near the gates, looked at them. There was a sign. It was a prison. I turned around, drove several dozen meters away, and the signal returned. I passed the point where my wife usually waited for her taxi, and suddenly it hit me. She had nowhere else to go here, which is why she always took a taxi from that distant point. This facility apparently jams signals, and as expected, there's no cell service here. I was ready to go and confront my wife about this, but she wouldn't just confess if I didn't catch her red-handed. She'd come up with excuses for any argument I made, if of course, I wasn't wrong in my calculations and suspicions. I remembered that she'd said she would be late again soon. 2 days later, I called her phone in the afternoon, and it was out of service range. Now or never, I thought. That day, I got in my car and headed to the now familiar address. On the way, I called once more to make sure I wasn't driving there for nothing, but the phone was still turned off. It seemed she was somewhere there. I arrived and parked a little further away where the gate lights wouldn't reach me. I started waiting. After half an hour, my wife really did come out. A couple of other people came out with her, apparently relatives of those inside. They got in a car and left. But Heather walked along that road to the place where there was still cell service, apparently to call a taxi as usual. I drove up behind her, honked, and she stepped aside into almost a snowdrift. I moved left, stopped, got out of the car and called out, "Hi, how are you here?" My wife asked how I was there, and without waiting for other meaningless questions from her, I said I knew about all her social media activities and that there had been no overtime at work. I had to lie a little. I said I'd spoken with a lawyer several weeks ago, and he'd found out where she was going and, most importantly, who she was seeing. I told her not to even think about making excuses and just to answer why she was doing all this and whether it wasn't shameful to sneak around like this in the evenings and lie to my face. Apparently, they'd met on social media. He was also apparently from there and worked in such a wonderful establishment. I don't know what attracted her to him, maybe a different attitude toward family values, since, as I understood, he already had children. But I think that seeing the world with more open eyes, as she wanted, won't happen soon with such a companion. The discovery at the prison changed everything I thought I knew about Heather and our marriage. This wasn't just about working late or even having an affair, this was about a completely different set of values and life choices. When we moved to the big city, I thought we shared the same goals: career advancement, financial stability, building a future together. I thought the challenges would be external: adjusting to a new place, establishing ourselves professionally, managing our finances carefully until we got established. I never imagined that the real challenge would be discovering that my wife was drawn to a completely different kind of life than the one we'd planned together. The social media connection she'd made wasn't with a successful professional who could help her career or expand her social circle in positive ways. Instead, she'd found someone whose circumstances were about as far from our goals as possible. What troubled me most wasn't just the deception, but what it revealed about Heather's character and judgment. She'd been willing to lie repeatedly about working late, to spend our limited savings on expensive taxi rides to visit someone in prison, and to risk everything we'd worked toward for a relationship that had no positive future. The elaborate nature of her deception was also striking. She'd created this entire fiction about overtime work, knowing I'd be supportive because we'd agreed that career advancement was our priority. She'd used my own goals and values against me to cover for behavior that was completely contrary to those same goals and values. The prison visits also explained her sudden interest in the city's social media pages and her requests for more entertainment and expensive purchases. She wasn't adapting to city life in the way we'd discussed. She was being influenced by someone whose lifestyle and values were completely different from what we'd planned. Heather's choice to pursue this relationship revealed something fundamental about her priorities and decision-making that I'd completely missed. The fact that she was willing to jeopardize our financial situation, our relationship, and our carefully planned future for someone she'd met online who was working in jail showed a level of impulsiveness and poor judgment that I hadn't seen before. The geographic isolation of her meetings also showed how calculated her deception had been. She'd figured out exactly where cell service was blocked, where she could meet without being tracked, and how to create a plausible cover story for her absences. But perhaps most telling was her reaction when confronted. Instead of shame or remorse, she seemed almost defiant, as if I was being unreasonable for questioning her choices. This wasn't someone who'd made a mistake or poor decision in a moment of weakness. This was someone who'd systematically planned and executed a double life for months while lying to my face every day. The prison visits were just the visible symptom of a much deeper problem. Heather and I had fundamentally different values and approaches to life, and the stress of our big life change had revealed those differences in the starkest possible way. Moving to a new city was supposed to be the beginning of building our future together. Instead, it became the setting where I discovered that the person I'd married wasn't who I thought she was. The empty field where Heather waited for her taxi rides became a perfect metaphor for our relationship from the outside. It looked like nothing was there, but hidden just out of sight was something that changed everything. That's how I learned that sometimes the biggest betrayals aren't about other people. They're about discovering that your partner has completely different values and priorities than you thought they did. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted was living a double life, or if you found out that major life changes revealed hidden aspects of your partner's character, share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've got a story about deception that went deeper than you ever imagined, send it to me. My contact's in the description. Because the next story proves that sometimes betrayal isn't just about what someone does. It's about who they really are underneath the facade.